I still remember the sound. The church bells tolled softly in the distance, echoing through the cold gray air of that morning. My hands clutched the folded program with his picture on the front. My husband, the man I had spent the best years of my life with, now gone forever. The pews creaked as a few neighbors shuffled in, offering me tight hugs and murmured words of comfort. My husband's colleagues from work sat quietly near the front, some with tears rolling down their cheeks. Even distant acquaintances, people who barely knew us, had taken the time to show up and pay their respects. But as I looked around the room, my heart sank into a pit so deep it almost crushed me. Not a single family member was there. Not my cousins, not my siblings, not even my parents. The truth hit me like a knife. My entire family had chosen to abandon me on the darkest day of my life. I felt my throat tighten. I kept telling myself maybe they were just late. Maybe the weather or traffic had delayed them. But as the minister stepped up to begin the service and the doors creaked shut behind him, I knew they weren't coming. And the bitterest part? A small piece of me wasn't even surprised, because this wasn't just about the funeral. This was about years, decades of judgment, criticism, and rejection. This was the final proof that no matter what I did, no matter how much I begged for their love and acceptance, my family had never truly been in my corner. Let me take you back, because to understand why my parents and siblings could so cruelly ignore my husband's funeral, you need to know the story of us. How I met him, how they hated him, and how their disapproval poisoned everything. I was 23 when I first met Daniel. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't rich, and he certainly wasn't the kind of man my parents imagined for me. But he was kind. His laugh could light up a room, and when he looked at me, I felt seen in a way I never had before. At the time, I had just started my first real job. My parents, strict and controlling, had always mapped out my life like I was a doll they could move around. I was supposed to marry someone with status, a doctor, a lawyer, or better yet, a business heir, someone they could brag about at family gatherings. But Daniel, he was working at a local mechanic shop finishing up night classes in engineering. He didn't have much, but he had dreams, and more importantly, he had integrity. From the moment I introduced him to my family, I could feel the walls go up. At dinner, my father asked him about his career plans, his income, his family background, everything except who he was as a person. My mom gave me that tight, polite smile she always wore when she disapproved but didn't want to say it out loud yet. My sisters exchanged glances, almost smirking, as if they already knew how this would end. Later that night, my mom pulled me aside. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "you can't be serious about him. He's nice, I guess, but nice doesn't pay the bills. Nice doesn't build a future." I remember the sting of those words, as if love didn't matter, as if kindness and loyalty meant nothing unless it came wrapped in a six-figure salary and a shiny title. But I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had something real. Daniel respected me, encouraged me, and treated me as his equal, and no amount of parental disapproval was going to scare me away from that. Of course, my family didn't let it go. The months turned into years, and with every step I took closer to Daniel, my family pushed further away. When I got engaged, my mother didn't congratulate me. She sighed. My father asked, "Are you sure you want to tie yourself to someone with so little ambition?" My sister sneered, "I give it 3 years tops." Still, Daniel and I pressed forward. Our wedding day was small but beautiful. We couldn't afford the grand banquet hall my parents envisioned for me, so instead we got married in a modest garden. Friends decorated the space with fairy lights, neighbors cooked food, and I wore a simple gown I had saved for myself. It wasn't lavish, but it was ours. And in that moment, as Daniel slipped the ring onto my finger with tears in his eyes, I had never felt richer. But my family, they made their feelings clear. They attended, yes, but their presence was ice cold. No smiles in the photos, no heartfelt speeches, just stiff faces, disapproving eyes, and a wall between us that grew higher every year. After the wedding, things only got worse. Every family gathering was a reminder that Daniel wasn't welcome. My parents would gush about my brother's new car, my sister's fiancé's promotion, my cousin's luxurious honeymoon. But when it came to me, silence, or thinly veiled comments like, "I hope you're doing okay financially," or, "Well, you've chosen your path." Daniel noticed. Of course he did. And though he tried to shrug it off with a smile, I could see the hurt in his eyes every time my family treated him like he was invisible. Still, he never complained, he never lashed out, he just kept loving me, building our life brick by brick. He worked long hours, finished his degree, and eventually landed a stable job in an engineering firm. We weren't rolling in money, but we were comfortable. Happy. At least, we were until his health began to falter. But that's for later. For now, I want you to sit with this image. A young couple building a life together in the shadow of a family's cold disapproval. Every holiday, every birthday, every dinner was a reminder that no matter what we did, it would never be enough for them. And yet, when Daniel passed away far too soon, leaving me shattered and alone, a part of me still held out hope that my family would step up, that they'd put aside their judgment and show me love when I needed it most. But they didn't, not even for his funeral. That day in the church, as the minister spoke about Daniel's kindness and his quiet strength, I gripped the edges of the pew and tried not to sob, because all I could think was this: if the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally can't even show up when your world falls apart, then did they ever love you at all? And in that moment, I vowed something to myself. This was the last time I would ever beg for their presence, because from that day forward, I would stop looking backward at the family that abandoned me and start looking forward to the life I would build without them. After the funeral, when the last guest had left and the church doors closed behind me, I sat in the empty hall, staring at the flowers that were already beginning to wilt. My heart wasn't just broken because I lost Daniel. It was broken because I realized that my family had chosen to break it even further. But truthfully, this had been coming for a long time. Their absence at his funeral was just the final act of a long play in which they had always cast him as the villain. You see, my family had a way of putting people into categories. There were those who met their standards, wealthy, ambitious, socially polished, and those who didn't. My siblings' partners fell into the first category. Daniel fell into the second. And no matter what he did, my parents never let him forget it. I'll give you an example. A few years after our wedding, my sister Rachel got engaged to a man named Jonathan. He was a banker with a 6-figure salary, perfectly pressed suits, and a tendency to look down his nose at anyone who wasn't like him. My parents adored him instantly. At family dinners, they'd pour him extra wine, laugh at his mediocre jokes, and beam whenever he bragged about his latest deal. When Daniel tried to join in the conversation, offering his perspective as an engineer, they would brush him off. "Oh, that's nice," my mom would say vaguely, before turning the topic back to Jonathan's career. My father once even muttered, "Engineering's fine, but banking is where the real money is." The double standard was obvious. When Jonathan bought my sister a designer purse, my mother gushed about how generous and thoughtful he was. When Daniel surprised me with a modest necklace he had saved for months to buy, she sniffed, "It's sweet, I suppose, but I hope you're being practical with your finances." It wasn't just Jonathan either. My brother's girlfriend Claire was a medical student. My parents practically worshipped her. They bragged about her to every friend, every relative, every neighbor. "Our son's dating a future doctor." Meanwhile, when I mentioned that Daniel had completed his engineering degree and landed a respectable job, they nodded politely and moved on as if I'd said nothing at all. Every family gathering felt like a stage, and Daniel was always shoved into the shadows while everyone else basked in the spotlight. The cruelty was subtle at first, a raised eyebrow here, a dismissive comment there, but as the years went on, it became sharper, more deliberate. One Christmas, my parents gifted Jonathan a luxury watch and Claire an expensive stethoscope kit. Daniel, they gave him a pair of socks. And not even nice ones, discount bin socks. I'll never forget the look on his face as he pulled them out of the wrapping paper, forcing a smile while everyone else unwrapped lavish gifts. My stomach twisted with rage, but my parents acted as if nothing was wrong. That night, as we drove home, Daniel said quietly, "It's fine. I don't need their approval. I just need you." But I could hear the hurt in his voice, and it broke me. It wasn't just gifts, it was respect, or the lack of it. When Daniel and I bought our first small house together, my father scoffed. "It's in that neighborhood? You should have waited until you could afford something better." Meanwhile, when Rachel and Jonathan moved into a high-rise apartment they could barely afford, my parents praised them as so responsible and so ambitious. When Daniel worked long nights to finish a project at his firm, my mom sighed. Well, I guess that's what happens when you don't have a high-paying career. You have to struggle. Yet, when Claire complained about the stress of medical school, my mom fussed over her like she was the bravest person alive. The message was clear. No matter how hard Daniel worked, no matter how much he accomplished, it would never be enough for them. The worst part was how they treated me because of him. Every time I visited without Daniel, my parents would corner me. "You could have done better," my father would say bluntly. "You were top of your class. You had potential. Why did you waste it on him?" My mother's words cut even deeper. "He's holding you back. You could have married into a better life." They acted as if Daniel was an anchor dragging me down, instead of the steady, loving partner who had supported me through everything. They couldn't, or wouldn't, see how he lifted me up in ways no one else ever had. At first, I tried defending him. I'd tell them about his promotions, about how he volunteered at the community center, about the way he treated me with unwavering kindness. But every defense was met with rolled eyes or a dismissive, "That's nice, dear." Eventually, I stopped trying, because nothing I said could penetrate the wall of disdain they had built around him. As the years passed, the gap between me and my family grew wider. Holidays became battles. Family dinners ended in tears. And slowly, I realized that they didn't just dislike Daniel, they resented him. They resented that I had chosen him over the kind of man they wanted for me. They resented that I was happy in a way that didn't fit their blueprint. And deep down, I think they resented that Daniel represented everything they couldn't control. Because with him, I had finally started living life on my own terms. But no amount of happiness with Daniel could protect us from the storm that was coming. It started small, a cough that wouldn't go away, fatigue that lingered too long, trips to the doctor that ended with vague reassurances. But soon, the diagnosis came, a diagnosis that changed everything. Daniel was sick, seriously sick. And in that moment, when our world turned upside down, I thought, maybe, just maybe, my family would finally put aside their judgment and step up for me, for us. But I was wrong. So, very wrong. When the doctor finally uttered the words "Stage 4, it felt like the ground had vanished beneath me. Daniel squeezed my hand, not with fear, but with the same quiet strength he always carried. His first words weren't about himself, they were about me. "We'll get through this," he whispered. But even as he said it, I saw the flicker of worry in his eyes. From that day forward, our lives revolved around hospital visits, treatments, and the slow, grinding reality of fighting cancer. I was terrified, exhausted, and holding on to hope by a thread. And in those desperate days, I reached out to my family. Surely, I thought, surely this would be the thing that opened their eyes. Surely they'd realize that this wasn't about judgment, money, or comparisons anymore. This was life or death. I called my parents the night after the diagnosis. My voice cracked as I explained what we were facing. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then my mother sighed. "Oh, honey," she said flatly, "these things happen." That was it. No, "we'll be there." No, "how can we help?" Just a weary, detached tone, as though I had told her Daniel had a common cold. My father's response cut even deeper. "Well, you chose him. You knew what you were getting into. Don't expect us to clean up the mess." I sat there in stunned silence, phone pressed to my ear, my chest aching like it might split open. Daniel was battling for his life, and my own parents dismissed him like he was disposable. But I refused to give up. I reached out to my sister, Rachel. She answered on the second ring, her voice chipper. "Hey, I was just about to tell you we're planning our summer trip to Italy. Jonathan wants to see Florence." My throat tightened. "Rachel, it's Daniel. He's really sick. Cancer. The doctors say..." "Oh, wow, that's, rough. But listen, I really don't know much about that kind of stuff. And with everything going on, I don't think we'll be able to visit." Her voice softened, but not with compassion, only pity. "Don't take this the wrong way, but maybe it's better you focus on him and we'll, pray or something." Then she changed the subject back to her trip. My brother Mark wasn't any better. When I told him, he muttered, "Damn, that's tough." Then, after a long pause, he added, "But look, I really can't be around hospitals. They creep me out. Besides, Claire's residency schedule is insane right now. We don't have time." Time. That word haunted me, because Daniel didn't have time. And yet the people who claimed to love me most, my parents, my siblings, acted as if his fight wasn't worth theirs. The months that followed were some of the darkest of my life. I drove Daniel to every chemo session, sat beside him as he vomited into hospital buckets, held him when his body shook from the medications. I worked double shifts to cover bills, stayed up late filling out insurance paperwork, and still somehow managed to smile for him so he wouldn't see how broken I felt. Not once did my family show up. They never offered to drive him. They never sent food. They never called to ask how he was doing. Instead, when they did call me, it was always about something else. Rachel needed advice about a dress for a gala. Mark wanted to brag about Claire's latest exam results. My parents wanted updates on everyone except Daniel. It was like he didn't exist. One evening, after a particularly grueling round of chemo, Daniel lay weak on the couch, his skin pale, his hair falling out in tufts, and I sat beside him, fighting tears. He reached over, brushing his thumb across my knuckles. "Don't be angry at them," he said softly. "They don't understand. But you do. That's all I need." I shook my head. "It's not enough. You deserve more. You deserve a family who loves you, who shows up for you. And they should love you because I love you." His eyes, though clouded with pain, held that same quiet warmth. "Maybe they'll see one day," he murmured. "But if they don't, it's their loss, not ours." Weeks turned into months, and Daniel's condition worsened. The hospital became our second home. Nurses knew us by name. I memorized the sterile smell of disinfectant, the beeping machines, the hollow click of IV drips, and still my family stayed away. At one point, desperate, I begged my parents to visit. "Please," I sobbed over the phone. "He doesn't have much time left. If not for him, then for me. Please, I can't do this alone." My mother's reply was ice cold.
We raised you to be strong. You'll manage. Besides, it wouldn't be fair to your father to put him through that kind of sadness. Sadness! As though protecting themselves from sadness was more important than supporting their daughter through her husband's dying days. The last weeks of Daniel's life were a blur. He slipped in and out of consciousness, his once bright laugh reduced to faint murmurs. On his final night, I held his hand as the monitors beeped their cruel rhythm. I whispered every memory, every "I love you," every dream we had shared. And when his chest rose and fell for the last time, I felt part of my soul leave with him. The world went quiet. And then came the funeral. I sent out invitations to my entire family, even though I knew deep down they probably wouldn't come. Still, some part of me clung to hope. Surely this would be the thing that opened their eyes. Surely they'd realize that this wasn't about judgment, money, or comparisons anymore. This was life or death. But when the day arrived, not a single one of them walked through the doors. Not my parents, not Rachel, not Mark. The pews were filled with Daniel's coworkers, neighbors, even strangers he had helped through his volunteer work, people whose lives he had touched in ways my family never cared to see. But the seats reserved for family stayed empty. I gave the eulogy with a shaking voice, staring at those empty chairs, feeling the weight of betrayal heavier than grief itself. When it was over, as people hugged me and offered condolences, one thought echoed in my mind like a drumbeat. My family had abandoned me when I needed them most. And in that moment, I made a vow. I would never, ever forget what they had done, and I would never forgive it.
The days after Daniel's funeral blurred together like smeared ink on paper. I went through the motions, accepting casseroles from neighbors, replying to sympathy cards, returning Daniel's things that the hospital had packed into a plastic bag, but nothing felt real. The house was too quiet. His toothbrush still sat by the sink. His jacket hung on the coat rack, carrying his faint cologne. Every corner whispered his absence. But the silence from my family was louder than anything else. Not one phone call, not one text, not even a stiff condolence card in the mail. They knew he was gone. They knew I was grieving. And yet, nothing. It was as if Daniel had never existed to them, and as if my pain wasn't worth acknowledging. At first, I waited. I told myself maybe they were giving me space. Maybe they were too uncomfortable to find the right words. Maybe, just maybe, they would show up at my door one day, guilt heavy on their faces, ready to apologize. But weeks passed, then months, and the only sound from my parents was silence. The only voice I heard from my sister was on social media, where she posted endless pictures from Italy, smiling with a glass of wine in her hand. My brother uploaded photos of his new car, his new apartment, his perfect life. None of them ever said Daniel's name. One night, about 3 months after the funeral, I broke down. I had been holding Daniel's wedding ring, clutched in my palm so tightly it left an imprint. My chest heaved with sobs until I couldn't breathe. In my despair, I called my mother. My fingers trembled as I waited for her to answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice calm, as though nothing in the world was wrong. "It's me," I croaked. "Mom, I can't do this alone. I need you." There was a pause. Then she sighed. "You'll be fine," she said simply. "You always overreact." Overreact? Daniel died. He was my husband. And none of you even came to say goodbye? Her voice turned sharp. "Don't start with me. We didn't come because it wasn't our place. He wasn't family. You forced him into our lives, and we chose not to be part of it. That was our choice." My body went cold. I whispered, "So you're saying
he didn't matter? That I don't matter? You'll understand one day, she replied curtly. Now, I have to go. Your father doesn't like when I get worked up before bed. And she hung up. That was the last time I ever called my mother. I realized then that my family didn't just abandon me, they had erased me. My grief, my marriage, my love, none of it existed in their world. And I couldn't keep begging for scraps of compassion from people who had already decided I was disposable. So, I changed. It didn't happen overnight, but slowly a steel wall began to rise where my pain had been. I stopped checking my phone for their calls. I stopped replaying our last conversations in my head. I stopped hoping they would show up. Instead, I started focusing on myself and on the people who did care. Daniel's coworkers visited often, bringing groceries and company. A neighbor, Mrs. Patel, dropped off home-cooked meals and made sure I ate. Even strangers who had known Daniel through his volunteer work reached out, sharing stories of how he had changed their lives. Piece by piece, I built a patchwork family of kindness from people who had no obligation to love me, but chose to, anyway. And that choice mattered more than blood ever could. One evening, I sat down with Daniel's journal. He had kept one during his treatments, though he rarely spoke of it. I hadn't been able to bring myself to open it before, but something in me whispered it was time. His handwriting filled the pages, shaky at times, but always steady in tone. And on one page, written in bold letters, were the words, "If she ever doubts her strength, remind her, she is the fire. Even if the world turns cold, she will light her own way." I pressed the book to my chest, tears streaming down my face, not of sorrow this time, but of something fiercer. Daniel had believed in me when no one else did, and I wouldn't let his faith go to waste. Over the next year, I rebuilt myself. I took on more shifts at work, not just to stay busy, but to prove I could stand on my own. I joined a local support group for widows, where I found others who understood the strange, isolating pain of losing a partner too soon. I even started taking classes, something Daniel had always encouraged me to do, but I'd put off. Every step forward was a rebellion against the family who had left me behind, because every step said, I will survive without you. And then, out of nowhere, my family came knocking. Literally. One Saturday morning, nearly 2 years after Daniel's death, I heard a knock at my door. When I opened it, there stood my parents, Rachel, and Mark, all dressed neatly, like they were visiting out of obligation rather than love. My stomach churned. My father cleared his throat. "We thought it was time we reconnected," he said stiffly. Rachel smiled weakly, holding a bag of bakery goods. "We figured you could use some company." Mark shoved his hands in his pockets, avoiding eye contact. For a moment, I just stared at them, the anger and hurt boiling inside me. These were the people who hadn't lifted a finger while Daniel withered in a hospital bed, who hadn't sat beside me at his funeral, who told me he wasn't family. And now they wanted to reconnect? I stepped outside, shutting the door firmly behind me. "You don't get to come back now," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "You didn't be there when I begged. You weren't there when he needed you. You weren't there when I buried him alone. You don't get to walk in like nothing happened." My mother huffed. "We thought you'd moved past that by now." "Past it?" I snapped. "I had to claw my way out of the hole you shoved me into, and I did it without you." My father scowled. "That's no way to speak to your parents." I met his gaze, unflinching. "Parents don't abandon their children. You did. So no, you don't get that title anymore." Rachel looked stricken. We just thought. No, I interrupted. You thought wrong. You thought you could erase my husband. You thought my pain was inconvenient. You thought I'd come crawling back, desperate for your approval. But you were wrong. I took a deep breath, the fire in my chest burning brighter than the fear. I don't need you. I never did. And from now on, you're not my family. You're just strangers I shared DNA with. I turned and walked back inside, leaving them standing speechless on my porch. For the first time in years, I felt free. The chains of their neglect had finally snapped, and though the scars would always remain, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Daniel would be proud.
The door clicked shut behind me, muting their voices. For a long moment, I just leaned against the wood, chest rising and falling, my hands trembling. I had dreamed of that confrontation for years. Sometimes in my sleep, I would replay arguments, imagining the sharp comebacks I never gave. And now that it had happened, real, raw, final, I felt lighter than I had in years. But I also felt the ache, because no matter how much strength I had built, there's always a grief in realizing your family never loved you the way you needed them to. Still, as I stood in my quiet home, I realized something powerful. This house wasn't empty. It was full of Daniel's love. It was full of the friendships I had cultivated. It was full of me. And that was enough. That night, I sat on the couch with a cup of tea, scrolling through messages from the support group I had joined. A widow named Claire had posted about her struggle getting out of bed. Another woman, Miriam, shared a memory of her late husband singing terribly off-key in the car. I replied to both, offering encouragement, sharing one of Daniel's goofy quirks to make them smile. And as I typed, I realized I was no longer just surviving. I was giving back. My grief had transformed into connection. A month later, I stood at the community center where our support group met. Someone had asked me to speak, to tell my story to new members. I hesitated at first, me standing in front of strangers, peeling back scars that still sometimes ached. But then I remembered Daniel's journal. His words, "She is the fire. Even if the world turns cold, she will light her own way." So I stood. My voice shook at first, but then it grew steady. I spoke of Daniel's kindness, of the hospital nights, of the empty church on the day I buried him. I spoke of the silence of my family and the crushing loneliness. But then I spoke of what came after, of neighbors who showed up when blood didn't, of strangers who became sisters in grief, of the day I told my parents they had no claim to me anymore, and how free I felt. When I finished, the room was quiet, and then someone clapped, then another, until the whole group applauded, not for the pain I'd endured, but for the resilience I had built. And in that moment, I realized Daniel's legacy wasn't just love, it was strength. The seasons changed. Time softened some wounds, though others would always stay tender. I still had nights where I cried into his pillow, where I whispered to the empty air, asking what he would do, what he would say. But those nights became fewer, and the mornings after became brighter. I planted a garden in the backyard, something Daniel and I had always talked about but never had the time for. Tulips in spring, lavender in summer, mums in autumn. Each bloom felt like a piece of him smiling at me. Neighbors would pass by and compliment it, and I'd smile, saying, "It's for him." 2 years after Daniel's death, I got a message from Rachel. It was short, just, "I'm sorry, I miss you." I stared at it for a long time. The old me might have jumped at it, desperate to rekindle some scrap of sisterhood. But the woman I had become, She read it, sighed, and put the phone down. Because forgiveness isn't always about letting people back in. Sometimes it's about letting go of the hope they'll ever change. And I had already let go. One evening, while sipping tea by the window, I thought about what I would say to Daniel if he were sitting beside me. I imagined telling him about the confrontation with my family, about the support group, about the garden. I imagined him laughing, calling me stubborn the way he used to, kissing the top of my head. And in that imagined moment, I realized he wasn't gone. Not really. He was woven into every brave step I took, into every laugh I shared with new friends, into every flower that bloomed in the soil of our backyard. Grief had not erased him. It had transformed him into something eternal. My parents never tried again after that day on my porch. My siblings faded back into their own lives, their absence no longer a knife, but just a void, one I had filled with better people, better love. I no longer looked at family as bloodlines or surnames. Family was Daniel. Family was the women who sat in a circle at the community center, sharing their hearts. Family was Mrs. Patel leaving warm curry on my doorstep. Family was the coworker who remembered Daniel's birthday and sent me flowers every year since. Family was anyone who chose to show up. On the anniversary of Daniel's passing, I lit a candle and sat by the garden. The tulips were blooming, swaying gently in the breeze. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I hope I've made you proud." And deep in my chest, where grief had hollowed me out, there was warmth. Not a voice, not a vision, but a certainty that I had survived, that I had built something beautiful out of pain, that even though not a single family member came to his funeral, I had carried his love forward, and that mattered more than anything else. Because sometimes the family we lose reveals the family we find. And sometimes the silence of those who should have loved us the loudest only teaches us to love ourselves louder. I wasn't alone anymore. Not really. And I never would be again.